Late summer, 1944, France. The Allied breakout from Normandy was a success, but now the real war began. The German army, retreating but not broken, had dug into the French countryside like ticks, transforming every ancient stone wall, every dense forest, and every sleepy village into a fortress. They were masters of defense, and they turned the push toward Germany into a meat grinder. For the Allied bomber commands, it was a nightmare. Heavily defended German supply depots, command posts, and troop concentrations were nestled so deep within civilian areas or rugged terrain that conventional daytime bombing was impossible without catastrophic collateral damage. Sending in the big boys, the B-17s and Lancasters, was like using a sledgehammer to perform brain surgery. At night, the flak was a black curtain woven with steel, a death trap for any pilot foolish enough to fly low and slow enough for accuracy. The advance was bogging down. The cost in blood and treasure was soaring. High command needed a miracle. What they got was a joke. At least, that's what General Patton called it when he first heard the proposal. A damned public relations stunt. The proposal came from a quiet, stubborn major in the Women's Army Corps named Evelyn Reed. The proposal was this: give her and her squadron of 20 all-black, all-female pilots the chance to hit the targets no one else could. Her unit, the 777th Provisional Bombardment Squadron, was not even an official part of the Air Force. They were an experiment, a collection of women who had fought their way through the segregated civilian pilot training programs, only to be told the Army had no place for them as combat pilots. They were mechanics, ferry pilots, and typists. But in secret, after hours, they trained. Their bombers were a fleet of 24 Piper L-4 Grasshoppers, tiny, single-engine reconnaissance planes that the male pilots mockingly called flying lawnmowers. They were made of nothing more than fabric stretched over a wood and steel frame. They had no armor, no radios, no defensive machine guns, and no parachutes. The planes were too small and light to make them practical. They were, by every metric, the most useless aircraft on the European front. And that was the key to Major Reed's insane, brilliant plan. The Germans called them the Banshees. The name started as a terrified whisper in the trenches outside St. Lo. It was a sound that did not belong in a war. It was not the scream of a dive bomber or the drone of a heavy 4-engine bomber fleet. It started as the faint, sputtering, pop, pop, pop of a tiny engine, a sound so pathetic the German sentries would laugh, searching the night sky for the foolish little spotter plane. But then, the sound would simply stop. Dead silence. And in that silence, a new sound would emerge. A soft, ghostly whoosh. The sound of wind moving over fabric wings. It was the sound of death gliding silently out of the darkness. The Banshees flew only at night. They'd approach their targets at a few thousand feet, the tiny engine guiding them through the darkness. Then, over the target, the pilot would do the unthinkable. She'd cut the engine completely. In the sudden, shocking silence, the tiny plane became a glider, a ghost in the machine. With the German sound detectors now deaf and the searchlight crews confused, the pilot would slip into a gentle, controlled dive. Her co-pilot, crammed into the seat behind her, would lean out of the open cockpit, a 50-pound mortar shell or a bundle of fragmentation bombs held in her hands, and drop them by eye onto the unsuspecting targets below. Warehouses would erupt in flame. Command tents would vanish. Fuel trucks would detonate in spectacular fireballs. And by the time the Germans understood what had happened, all they would hear was the faint pop, pop, pop of the engine restarting as the Banshee slipped away back into the darkness. To the German soldiers on the ground, it was psychological torture. They could fight tanks. They could shoot at bombers. But they could not fight the silence. They could not shoot at a sound that sounded like the wind. The Iron Cross was automatically awarded to any German pilot who could shoot down one of these fabric ghosts. But it was almost impossible. They were too small, too slow, and flew too low to be caught by the faster, heavier German night fighters. They were phantoms, and the fear they spread was 100 times more effective than the small bombs they carried. Back at the Allied base, the women of the 777th were treated with a mixture of awe and contempt. They were succeeding where the men had failed, embarrassing the top brass. They were given the worst supplies, the oldest maps, and quartered in leaky tents far from the main airfield. But every night, they flew. Led by Major Reed, a woman whose calm demeanor hid a core of pure, unbending steel, they climbed into their paper-thin airplanes, armed with little more than courage and a few bombs, and flew into the dark. They knew they were expendable. They knew they were a joke to the very command that sent them on their missions. But they also knew that in the skies over France, they were not just women, not just black soldiers. They were the Banshees, and they were winning the war, one terrifying whisper at a time. What do you think is more terrifying to a soldier on the ground? The loud, screaming roar of an incoming bomber, or the dead, unnatural silence that comes right before it? Let me know your thoughts down below. The mission that would turn the 777th from a ghost story into a legend came on a moonless, rain-swept night in mid-September. The target was codenamed the Dragon's Teeth, a sprawling, heavily fortified railway hub just east of Nancy. It was the linchpin of the entire German supply network for the sector. Through this yard, a constant stream of ammunition, fuel, and elite panzer reinforcements flowed to the front, bleeding the American advance dry. For 2 weeks, the 8th Air Force had thrown everything they had at it. Daylight precision bombing had failed, the bombs scattering harmlessly against reinforced concrete bunkers. Nighttime carpet bombing had proven equally useless and horrifically costly, with a dozen B-24 Liberators lost to the most concentrated ring of anti-aircraft defenses in all of France. The Dragon's Teeth was more than a rail yard. It was a fortress, protected by over 188mm flat cannons, dozens of searchlights, and a dedicated squadron of Focke-Wulf 190 night fighters. The place was a death sentence. And now, it was the Banshee's problem. The briefing, held in a drafty, lamp-lit tent, was grim. Major Evelyn Reed stood before a massive annotated map, her face a calm mask that betrayed none of the crushing weight on her shoulders. Before her sat her 20 pilots and their co-pilot/bombardiers. Women like Lieutenant Hattie the Hawk Jackson, the squadron's best pilot, a woman who could feel the wind shifts in her bones and fly a grasshopper in a hurricane. And women like Corporal Simone the Saint Dubois, a young Creole woman from New Orleans who was the squadron's bombardier. She was not just accurate, she was a prodigy, able to calculate drop trajectories in her head with a savant's genius, accounting for wind speed, altitude, and the plane's glide ratio. She never missed. The mission was simple, and it was suicide. They were to fly in 2 waves. The first wave, 10 planes led by Reed herself, would act as decoys. They would approach from the north with their engines on, deliberately drawing the attention of the German searchlights and flak. Their goal was not to bomb, but to survive, to create a massive, chaotic light show and pull the entire German defensive screen away from the real target. The second wave, led by Hattie Jackson and with Simone Dubois as lead bombardier, would approach from the south, engines off, gliding in under the umbrella of chaos created by the first wave. Their target? A single, massive, concrete-reinforced switching station at the heart of the rail yard. If they could destroy that one building, the entire network would be paralyzed for weeks. As the women walked towards their flimsy aircraft, the mood was electric, with a quiet, fatalistic resolve. They checked their planes by flashlight, their movements practiced and professional. There were no last-minute letters home, no tearful goodbyes. They were beyond that. They were warriors, and this was the night they would either earn their place in history or be erased by it. Hattie Jackson climbed into the pilot seat of her grasshopper, which she had nicknamed the Voodoo Queen. Simone Dubois squeezed in behind her, arranging 4 custom-made 50-pound thermite bombs around her feet. The bombs were another of the squadron's innovations, designed not just to explode, but to burn, to melt steel and turn concrete to dust. Simone gave Hattie's shoulder a confident squeeze. "Just get me over the house, Hawk," she said, her voice steady. "I'll put the fire in the fireplace." Hattie grinned, her face illuminated for a second by a flash of distant lightning. "You just hold on tight, Saint. We're about to make those boys on the ground really, really angry." As the first wave, led by Major Reed, approached the outer perimeter of the Dragon's Teeth, the night exploded. It was as if someone had flipped a switch on hell. 100 searchlight beams, thick as pillars of solid white light, stabbed into the sky, hunting for them. A second later, the flat cannons opened up. The sky became a solid wall of explosions, a deadly, churning cloud of orange, white, and black. The 10 tiny Piper Cubs, bucking and weaving like leaves in a storm, flew straight into it. It was a display of airmanship so audacious, so utterly insane, that the German gunners could not believe what they were seeing. These were not bombers. They were gnats, impossible to track, impossible to hit. Riedel voices, if they had had radios, would have been a calm litany of corrections and encouragement. She led her squadron through the labyrinth of light and steel, her plane dancing between the searchlight beams, the explosions of the 88mm shells buffeting her wings. They were a swarm of fireflies in a blender, a distraction so complete, so mesmerizingly suicidal, that every single gun and every single searchlight at the Dragon's Teeth turned to face them, trying to swat these infuriating little ghosts from the sky. No one, absolutely no one, was looking south. Miles away, Hattie Jackson pushed the stick forward, her eyes fixed on the distant chaos. "Engine off," she said, her voice a whisper. The little engines sputtered and died. The only sound now was the whistle of the wind over the fabric wings. The Voodoo Queen, followed by 9 other silent ghosts, tipped its nose down and began its long, final glide toward the dark heart of the rail yard. Simone Dubois leaned out of the open side of the aircraft, the wind tearing at her face. Her eyes narrowed in concentration. Below her, shielded by the maelstrom of the decoy attack, the rail yard was laid out like a map, dark and unsuspecting. She could see the switching station, a blocky, arrogant shape of concrete and steel, the nerve center of the whole operation. It was resting in perfect, peaceful darkness, completely unaware of the silent death that was gliding down upon it from the heavens. She held the first thermite bomb in her hands, the metal cold against her leather gloves. The German war machine had built a fortress to keep out the thunder. They had never planned for a whisper. The glide was an exercise in controlled terror. For Hattie Jackson, the pilot, her entire world was reduced to the feel of the stick in her hand and the whisper of the wind over the wings. Every gust and every pocket of turbulence was a living thing to be negotiated with. She was no longer flying a machine. She was riding a kite on the edge of a storm. Her eyes, long adjusted to the deep darkness, picked out the subtle landmarks on the ground: a bend in a river, the dark shape of a forest, the faint glimmer of a road, using them to triangulate her course. The chaos to the north was her guiding star, a pulsating, violent aurora that told her exactly where the enemy was looking. Below and ahead, the rail yard grew from a dark patch into a complex grid of tracks and buildings. She was a hawk, circling high above her prey, utterly silent, utterly invisible. And behind her, Simone Dubois was the loaded arrow in the bow, her focus even more intense. She was not just looking at the target, she was feeling it. She noted the speed of the wind by the pressure on her face, judged their altitude by the size of the boxcars below. She was in a state of pure, zen-like concentration, a human bomb sight more accurate than any piece of mechanical hardware. The first sign of trouble came not from the ground, but from the air. A German night fighter, a Focke-Wulf 190, its pilot, drawn like a moth to the flame of the flak barrage, peeled away from the main action. Perhaps his fuel was low, perhaps he was bored, or perhaps a flicker of instinct told him something was wrong. He began a lazy circling descent, his dark shape a deeper black against the starless, cloud-choked sky. He was not actively hunting them, but his patrol path was about to intersect their glide slope. For the 10 silent planes of the second wave, then he was a cruising shark that had no idea a school of fish was about to swim right into its mouth. Hattie saw him first, a fleeting shadow that blocked out a patch of the distant fiery glow. Her heart hammered against her ribs, but her hands on the controls remained rock steady. To alter her course now would be to throw off Simone's entire calculation. To restart the engine would be to announce their presence to the entire German army. So there was nothing she could do. She had to hold the line. She had to trust the darkness, and she had to fly straight at the hunter and pray he was looking the other way. Simone, leaning far out into the wind, was oblivious to the approaching fighter. Her universe had shrunk to a single point, the flat, tarred roof of the switching station, now less than half a mile away. The details were becoming sharp, crisp. She could see the ventilation shafts, the steel access ladder on the side, the concrete blast walls surrounding it. She began to make her final calculations, her lips moving silently as she factored in the last few seconds of their descent. She held up one finger to Hattie, signaling 1 minute to drop. Hattie's eyes darted between the approaching German fighter and Simone's signal. The Focke-Wulf was closer now, its sleek, deadly profile momentarily silhouetted against an explosion from the northern barrage. He was still descending, still unaware. It was going to be close. Terribly, impossibly close. She held her breath, every muscle in her body tensed, waiting for the flash of machine gun fire that would tear their fragile aircraft and their mission to shreds. At that same moment, in the northern chaos, Major Evelyn Reed made a decision. She saw the German fighter peel off. She knew, with a commander's gut instinct, what was about to happen. Her decoy mission had been to draw fire, but now she had to do more. She had to give her second wave the cover they needed. She broke formation, pulling her tiny plane into a steep climbing turn, deliberately positioning herself in the beam of a massive searchlight. Her grasshopper was suddenly, brilliantly illuminated, a tiny silver moth pinned against a black wall. It was a suicidal move. Every flak gun that could bear swung towards her. The air around her became a solid mass of explosions. But she held it, forcing the German gunners, and more importantly, the searchlight operators, to focus on her. It was a desperate gamble, a sacrifice play of the highest order. At the same time, she was creating a massive, temporary blind spot. The searchlight pointed at her was no longer sweeping the southern approach. The gunners firing at her were not tracking for other targets. For a precious 30 seconds, she made herself the only target in the sky. The pilot of the Focke-Wulf saw the illuminated plane. He saw the concentrated storm of flak, an easy kill, a foolish American spotter plane that had strayed into the heart of the storm. He banked his fighter, abandoning his lazy descent, and turned to join the turkey shoot, eager to claim the prize. The shark had seen the bait and turned away from the real meal. Back on the Voodoo Queen, the danger had passed. Hattie let out a breath she did not realize she'd been holding. They were through. She gave a slight, almost imperceptible dip of the wing, a final course correction. Simone, still locked onto her target, felt the shift. It was time. The switching station was directly below them. It looked close enough to touch. She held the first thermite bomb over the side, her arm straining against the wind. The world stood still. There was no war, no flak, no fear. There was only the target and the bomb. She let go. The bomb dropped away, a dark teardrop falling into the night. It fell for 3 seconds that felt like an eternity. Then, the roof of the switching station simply vanished, replaced by a silent, brilliant, white-hot geyser of molten metal. The first explosion was not a sound. It was a feeling. A deep, resonant thump that traveled up from the ground, through the frame of the aircraft, and into the bones of every pilot in the second wave. It was the silent, concussive birth of a star. Simone Dubois did not wait to admire her handiwork. The first bomb was out, and the second was already in her hands. She leaned out again, her eyes fixed on the new, gaping, white-hot hole in the roof of the building. Her second bomb followed the first, a perfect follow-up shot that plunged directly into the heart of the wound. This time, the effect was catastrophic. The thermite, now inside the building, found the massive electrical transformers and switching gear that were the station's entire reason for being. The result was an eruption of pure energy. A huge blue-white dome of electrical fire pulsed outwards, vaporizing the concrete roof and turning the building into a man-made volcano. A cascade of sparks, like a million 4th of July sparklers, shot 1,000 feet into the air. And then, the entire rail yard went dark. Lights that had been burning in distant corners of the yard, shielded from the main attack, suddenly winked out. The power was cut. The dragon's brain was dead. As if on cue, the other 9 planes of the second wave released their own payloads. Their targets were not buildings, but the tracks themselves. A coordinated rain of smaller fragmentation bombs and demolition charges hailed down on the complex intersections and railway switches leading into and out of the yard. The result was not explosive, but brutally effective. The bombs did not just crater the ground. They twisted the steel rails into pretzels, shattered the switching mechanisms, and created a zone of impassable wreckage. In the space of 60 seconds, the 10 fabric gliders had accomplished what the entire 8th Air Force could not. They had not just damaged the rail yard. They had surgically disassembled it. They had rendered it completely, utterly useless. The mission was a success. But now came the hardest part, the survival. Hattie Jackson yelled over the roar of the wind, "Engine on! Let's go home." She jammed the throttle forward, and with a prayer, pulled the starter. The little engine coughed, sputtered, and roared back to life. Around her, the other 9 planes did the same, their engines adding to the sudden, shocking noise. The ghosts had revealed themselves. The German response was instantaneous and apoplectic. They had been tricked, humiliated, and gutted by an invisible enemy. The chaos of the Northern Barrage, which had been focused on Major Reed's suicidal charge, now had a new target. Searchlights, freed from their mesmerizing decoy, swung wildly south, stabbing into the darkness, hunting for the source of the new engine sounds. The flat cannons, their barrels still hot, followed suit. The sky, which had been a haven of darkness, suddenly became a web of light and explosions. For the women of the second wave, the gentle glide was over. Now they were in a desperate, full-throttle race to escape the collapsing killbox. Hattie threw the Voodoo Queen into a sharp, diving turn, the flimsy wings groaning under the strain. Explosions blossomed around them, the concussions tossing the tiny plane around like a toy. A piece of shrapnel, white-hot and jagged, tore through the fabric of the right wing, leaving a gaping hole. The plane shuddered violently, but Hattie held it steady, her knuckles white on the control stick. Meanwhile, to the north, Major Evelyn Reed was fighting for her life. Having successfully drawn the entire German defense, she was now paying the price. Her plane was a wreck, the fabric riddled with hundreds of holes, the rudder barely responsive. 2 of her decoy squadron had already gone down, their planes disintegrating in mid-air. But her sacrifice had worked. She saw the flashes of the successful bombing run to the south, the massive electrical eruption, and the subsequent chaos. She allowed herself a grim, fleeting smile. They did it. Now, her only job was to get as many of her people home as possible. She broke off her suicidal holding pattern and dived for the ground, leveling out just above the treetops, using the terrain to mask her escape. The remaining planes of her squadron scattered like seeds in the wind, each pilot on her own, running the gauntlet of sporadic ground fire and prowling night fighters. The flight back was a nightmare. The 10 planes of the bombing run and the 8 surviving decoys flew alone, navigating by instinct and memory, their planes battered, their fuel low. Hattie Jackson wrestled with the Voodoo Queen, the damaged wing making the controls heavy and unresponsive. Simone Dubois, her job done, could do nothing but sit in the back, clutching the sides of the fuselage, her body trembling with the aftershocks of adrenaline. They flew through rain and darkness, their eyes scanning the blackness for the friendly lights of their home airfield. One by one, they appeared out of the night. A flicker of landing lights, a sputtering engine, a prayer. Major Reed was the last to land, her plane so badly damaged it barely held together. As she taxied to a halt, the ground crew rushed out, their faces a mixture of awe and horror at the state of her aircraft. She climbed out of the cockpit, her face pale, but her eyes blazing. She began the count. 18 planes had gone out. 4 did not return. 8 women gone. It was a staggering loss. But as she looked at the grim, exhausted, triumphant faces of the survivors, she knew the price had been worth it. The Banshees had faced the dragon, and they had pulled its teeth. The dawn that followed the raid on the dragon's teeth was gray and somber. At the 777th makeshift airfield, the silence was heavy, punctuated by the metallic clang of tools as the ground crews worked feverishly to patch the holes in the surviving aircraft. The 14 battered Piper Cubs, parked in a ragged line, looked less like a military squadron and more like the victims of a hailstorm. Their fabric skins were shredded, their frames bent, their engines fouled. That they had flown at all was a miracle. That they had returned from the heart of the most heavily defended airspace in France was a statistical impossibility. The cost was steep. 8 empty chairs in the mess tent. 8 names that would be spoken in hushed, revered tones. But as the sun rose higher, so too did a new feeling among the survivors. The quiet, unshakable confidence of professionals who had faced the ultimate test and had not been found wanting. They had proven their worth, not to the generals or the army, but to themselves. And that was the only victory that truly mattered. The official reaction from high command was a study in bewilderment and bureaucratic absurdity. At first, they simply did not believe the after-action reports. A squadron of unarmed spotter planes, flown by women, had succeeded where hundreds of heavy bombers had failed. It was preposterous. It had to be a mistake, an exaggeration. But then the reconnaissance photos came in. The images, shot by a high-flying Spitfire at dawn, were undeniable. The rail yard was a scene of surgical devastation. The massive switching station was a gutted, burned-out husk. The tracks leading in and out were a tangled mess of twisted steel. The photos confirmed every detail of Major Reed's report. The Dragon's teeth was not just damaged, it was completely and utterly shut down. The effect on the front was immediate. The German armored counterattack, which had been poised to smash through the American lines, sputtered and died for lack of fuel and ammunition. The advance, which had been crawling, surged forward. Faced with irrefutable proof, the generals were forced to acknowledge the mission's success. But they could not bring themselves to acknowledge who had accomplished it. The official communiques praised the innovative nighttime tactics and the courage of unnamed air crews. The 777th was a secret, an inconvenient truth that did not fit the narrative. They were a weapon that command was simultaneously impressed by and embarrassed of. General Patton, upon seeing the photos, reportedly grunted, "Well, I'll be damned. The ladies went and did it." But there were no medals. There were no public commendations. The reward for the surviving women of the 777th was a fresh coat of paint for their patched-up planes and a new, even more dangerous, list of targets. They remained ghosts, their victories celebrated only in the silence of their own mess tent. But their legend was not confined to secret reports. It grew on the ground. For the American GIs pushing their way through France, the stories of the Banshees became a source of hope, a battlefield myth that was real. They would listen at night, and sometimes, on the wind, they would hear it, the faint, sputtering engine, followed by that eerie, terrifying silence. And they would know that somewhere in the darkness, help had arrived. For the Germans, the opposite was true. The name Banshee became a curse, a new source of psychological terror. Every unexpected explosion in the night, every unexplained fire, was blamed on them. They were everywhere and nowhere, a squadron of phantoms that had crippled the morale of the Wehrmacht more effectively than any artillery barrage. They were no longer a joke. They were the monster in the dark. Major Evelyn Reed stood on the edge of the airfield, watching as Hattie Jackson and Simone Dubois supervised the loading of new bombs into the patched-up fuselage of the Voodoo Queen. They were preparing for another night, another mission. The 4 empty cots in her own tent were a constant, aching reminder of the price of their success. The army might never recognize them. The world might never know their names. But she knew. She looked at the faces of her women, tired, grim, but filled with a fiery, unbreakable resolve. They were more than a squadron. They were a sisterhood, forged in secrecy and baptized in fire. They had been given the scraps, the planes no one wanted, the missions no one could survive. And with them, they had changed the course of the war. They did not need medals. Their legacy was written in the burning wreckage of the Third Reich's war machine. The Banshees were flying again tonight, and the enemy would know fear in the silence.